My name is Michael Pagano. I'm Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs and co-director of the UIC Urban Forum. On behalf of Chancellor Emeritus and Provost Poser, I invite all of you to come and join for the day's discussion and activity around autonomous vehicles. This is the 8th UIC Urban Forum that's been held here on campus. And this year, the focus is on autonomous vehicles and what I consider is the future of being able to drive safely while sleeping. So let me tell you a bit about the history of the Urban Forum. The University of Illinois Chicago has hosted an annual conference on issues that are vital and important to the well-being of cities since 1995, first under the auspices of the Great Cities Institute, what was called the Winter Forum. And then in 2005, in collaboration with the Daley family, the Richard J. Daley Urban Forum was hosted by UIC until 2010. In 2012, the UIC Urban Forum, a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Illinois Chicago, with the support of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, began. And so we are now in our 8th year of this annual event. This year, the co-director, along with me, is P.S. Sriraj, the director of the Urban Transportation Center, who will be introducing the other panels later. If you look at the program, which you should all have, in fact, you should have 2 items on your chair. One is the free gift that everyone receives. Every year, we identify authors of certain segments of the theme who write white papers for the Urban Forum, and those white papers go through a set of revisions and comments from readers and others, and the University of Illinois Press then publishes the book. And the book that you have in front of you are the proceedings from the white papers of last year, which was called The People's Money. It was on municipal government finances. The second thing you will see on your chair is the program. So the order of the day is outlined in the program. After a keynote presentation by the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy of the United States Department of Transportation, Finch Fulton, 2 large moderated panels will follow with approximately 15 minutes of question and answer. If you have when we get to the Q&A part of it, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and there will be people with microphones who will come around who can ask the question, give you the microphone so you can ask the question. There will also then be a second keynote address between the 2 panels by the new Executive Director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, Aaron Alleman. Then after that is the second panel, and then it'll be followed by a box lunch that you can stay here and continue to talk among yourselves or take it with you back to your office. The UIC Urban Forum would like to recognize our partners in this undertaking, including public media, WBEZ, which I hope you heard the announcements over the last month about this event, the American Automobile Association, the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement here at UIC, as well as the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. So thank you for your support and collaboration. I'd also like to recognize, before we get too deeply into this, I'd like to recognize the organizing committee who spent the last 6 months trying to pull this together, including Jennifer Woodard, Norma Ramos, Ed Burry, Brian Flood, Cam Johnson, Taylor Long, and Carla Bailey, as well as Jenny Sweeney, who's been the events coordinator for these events without ever an error since in the early 2000s. So thanks to Jenny and the rest. The UIC's Urban Forum, the first speaker today is Finch Fulton. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at US DOT. He has served as a member of the President's transition team, focusing on transportation and infrastructure policy, and with the Department of Transportation as a special advisor to the Secretary on Transportation Policy. He served in the House of Representatives under Congressman Jim McCurry and Congressman John Fleming, and in the Senate for Senator Jeff Sessions. In addition, he's worked in public affairs at Vox Global, devising and executing integrated policy and advocacy campaigns. He's a native of Mobile, Alabama, a graduate of the University of Alabama, having received his MBA from Johns Hopkins, and was most recently a resident of Dallas, Texas, and as he just informed me, a lifelong connection to the trucking industry, where he spent his youth learning about the automobile industry, the truck industry, and transportation. Finch, welcome.
Thank you, Dean Pagano. It's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of Secretary Elaine Chao and the U.S. Department of Transportation. But I can tell you it is wholly selfish when Cesar Singh, one of the leaders at the U.S. Department of Transportation and a graduate of UIC, was talking about all the research and all the things that UIC has cooking. We knew that we needed to make sure that we were engaged because there's a lot of work that we have to do. And a lot of the things that Illinois is planning to work on, a lot of the things that Chicago has going on, and a lot of the things that UIC is working on are things that we need to make sure we work together on because there's a lot of questions that are unanswered about the path forward for automated vehicles. So the good thing, highlighting my role here, is I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, and one of the things I get to lead is the New and Emerging Transportation Technology Council. So some of the work that we're doing obviously revolves around automated vehicles. Some of the work is about, these new tunneling technologies that we're seeing, and also Hyperloop and things like this. But what's wonderful for me is, by the way, if you ever Google me, which my colleagues have done to make fun of me, it says, Finch Fulton, did you want to ask about his age? So I'm 33, relatively young, but what's wonderful about that is as I joined the transition and as I worked on these technologies, no one else had any more experience than I did in these areas, right? There are no experts. It's all us, just figuring it out as we go, taking this federalized approach, seeing what's working in different areas, making sure we use process and inclusion and coordination and cooperation to answer the questions that we all have. But no one knows the answers any better than any of you. So as we look to engage the research community, as we look to engage the students, I urge you to focus and get excited about this area. Transportation and logistics are already a little under 9% of GDP and a little over 9% of jobs. And that's growing. There's billions of dollars in investments going on in this area. We're reshaping the way our nation's going to move people and goods for decades to come. It's an exciting area to be a part of and something that I think as we look for the research community to get involved, you'll have an active voice and there's going to be tremendous opportunities that are coming forth. So thank you for having me. We're very excited to be here. Thank you. So as we're looking towards these technologies, it is interesting because we have to think through, what authorities do we have to bring to these technologies? We have to ask questions like, when does an electric scooter become something that the Department of Transportation has to deal with? When does a bike become a motorcycle? Questions like these, and by the way, if you're curious, a scooter, if it's reasonably likely to be on a highway, then our authorities come into play. Otherwise, we treat it like a bicycle, which the Consumer Product Safety Commission comes into play. And that's if it goes over 20 miles per hour, and if it has a seat, it can be reasonably expected to be driven on a highway, even if it's not a good idea. So we work closely with our partners in the federal government. But as we look to how we approach automated vehicles, first and foremost, let me go back a slide. As we came in, so the previous administration had done a terrific job putting out the first federal automated vehicle guidance policy. Now, this was a big document that sort of asked some of the big questions and explored some of the authorities that existed in the department and how would we use our self-certification regime to prove the safety of these vehicles. It was great work. What we wanted to do is, as we approach these technologies, we really took a simplified version and just created a cornerstone based on safety. The document, ADS 2.0, just focused on what are the 12 areas that automated vehicle developers need to be able to prove so that they can put a vehicle on the road someday. Now, we did focus on a voluntary approach because it's early in these technologies, so we need to make sure that we have an approach that's bottoms up where all of our developers and inventors are working together with us to approach safety. So we have voluntary self-safety assessments that a lot of our partners are posting. We have about 18 of them focusing on those 12 areas that were on that slide. But this really serves as the cornerstone. Everything that we're allowed to focus on has to start with safety as the basis for everything we work on. And what we've done recently is expanded this safety approach throughout all the different modes of transportation. So not just focused on vehicle safety, but also focused on the safety of the roadways, the safety of, commercial motor vehicles, the safety of transit vehicles. As we look to bring in these automated technologies, how can we expand the safety guidance? How can we bring it all together so that if you ask a question of about one mode of transportation, you have consistent answers and consistent logic across all modes of transportation? So we put this out last October. And so if we start with that cornerstone of safety and we bring it out to lay a foundation for all modes of transportation, how can we start building this together to figure out how to be able to integrate these together? And you see a lot of our approaches respecting and acknowledging the roles of the city and acknowledging the roles of the state. Transportation is very federalized. No one wants the Department of Transportation, the federal government, to dictate all the authorities and all the ways the operations can happen. And it makes sense in a few different ways. One, if you look at things like aviation, those are planes, they're big and scary and they're far away. Congress gave the Department of Transportation every authority in the world around airplanes. Who can operate on them, who can fly them, how they can be built, what sort of operations they can happen. They control the actual operations. We have it all. But when it comes to cars, we have almost none, right? No one wants to go to the federal government to change the speed limit in their neighborhoods. They want to yell at their city council person. They want to be able to pick up the phone and get somebody or go to the office and say, there are maniacs on my road, I want you to do something about this. So all of our authorities are very pushed down to the local and state level. Really, all we get to do is set new standards for new vehicles. At the basis, it's very simplified, but at its basic form, those are our authorities around these technologies. Everything else, we have to work with our state and local partners to drive out best practices and develop these things together so we can bring everybody in on the types of technologies and the types of operations they want to see on their roadways. So we spend a lot of time in this document talking about this and then talking about the standards that our researchers and our AV developers need to know are out there so they can build on a platform of safety based on the massive work that has already been done today. So you can download this at transportation.gov/AV. It's, I think, wonderful work and really outlines our approach. But one of the things that we have to make sure we're clear about how we're going to approach all of these things are included in our principles. Obviously, everything has to be about safety. If you lose safety as your North Star and as your foundation for all that you do, these technologies will not operate as intended, the public will lose trust, and the technologies will fail, and all of the potential safety outcomes we have will be lost. I think you've probably heard a lot of the stats. There are 37,000, roughly, fatalities on American roadways a year. 94% of those are caused by human error. About over 10,000 are caused by drunk drivers, have another 10,000 caused by speeding. Overlapping, you have around 10,000 that are people that aren't wearing their seatbelts. You see a lot of distracted driving concerns. If you can start using these technologies to remove human error so that you don't have drunk driving, that you don't have sleepy drivers or distracted drivers, you can start making some progress on the terrible safety numbers that we see on our roadways. So that's why we want to prioritize safety, and there's a huge amount of potential that these technologies can bring. But if we don't keep it on the forefront, people will never trust these vehicles and it all goes away. And it was just a big paper exercise. So we have to prioritize safety in each and everything. We're going to remain technology neutral. It's early on in these technologies. We don't think we know the best way to do this yet. It also means that we think that when you look at things like connected vehicles, yes, connected vehicles and automated vehicles are complementary. Not every automated vehicle has to be connected. If a connected vehicle existed, we don't want to dictate it has to be DSRC, dedicated short-range communications, or CV2X, commercial cellular to everything systems. We're trying to let the innovators come up with the systems that work best to have the best safety outcomes. We are going to be modernizing our regulations, which makes sense. If you created a regulatory structure where the human was operating the vehicle, it doesn't make sense when the vehicle is operating itself. So how do you update these things to have a more performance-based approach instead of prescriptive about how far away a steering wheel needs to be from somebody or how hard you have to press a brake? We're going to be working within the Department of Transportation itself and with our federal partners to ensure a consistent regulatory and operational environment. A lot of that is working with our state and local partners to figure out some of the best practices for the types of operations that you feel comfortable happening in your neighborhood. We're going to prepare proactively for automation, and we'll talk about this a little more in the study that we're doing around labor impacts of automated vehicles. It's justifiably worrisome. If you're an 18-wheeler driver, you're worried about what these technologies may mean for you, so how are we preparing for these impacts? And then, of course, we're going to use these technologies to protect and enhance the freedoms of all Americans. We want this to be a value add, not something that can take away some freedoms and take away the ability for people to drive their own vehicle. So some of the things I'd like to talk about, and by the way, we'll have a few minutes to take questions at the end of this, but we can lay this out. I think first and foremost, anytime you hear the Department of Transportation talking about these technologies, you're going to hear us talking about the safety band, the 5.9 gigahertz band of spectrum that is currently dedicated to transportation safety solutions. One of the reasons we have to talk about this so much is because as we have this approach to looking at DSRC or CV2X or future 5G technology for connected vehicles, this is the spectrum it has to operate in. This is a spectrum that can handle those sort of very quick communications that show where a vehicle is, how fast it's going, and where it's heading. The way the FCC created this rule for this spectrum right now, it's DSRC only. This is the first time the FCC ever chose a specific technology. So we have to preserve this for safety purposes, but at some point, the FCC will have to remove that mandate. And when the FCC looks at anything, they say, what is the most efficient use of the spectrum? And so they have to ask these big questions that could lead to, they could eventually decide that some of the spectrum may be better used for other purposes. So we need to make sure our stakeholders that are already using and investing in this know that at some point in time the FCC will be asking these questions, and we have to be engaged, we have to be able to work with them, and they have to receive the comments. They're an independent agency, so they have to hear from the actual users of the system about how they intend to develop these operations. And this is just a quick example of all of the connected vehicle deployments that are happening today. We're at a tipping point where you're seeing states investing heavily in the vehicle-to-infrastructure connections and some of those other applications that come about when you can connect vehicles. So these are being deployed today. They're being actively used. Every part of that spectrum is being used, and you're seeing massive investments. We only have the U.S. DOT numbers in here, but you're talking billions of dollars when you're talking about all the state deployments throughout the country. So you will always hear us talk about this because it's something that you will all have to be actively paying attention to and engaged on when the FCC moves forward, which could be soon. It could take them a while. We are currently doing studies to determine if we can share the spectrum in any ways safely while not ruining the safety of the system. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of problem. All right. So yesterday we had a terrific event at the Department of Transportation where we rolled out $60 million in automated driving system demonstration grants. So one, this was important because we are at a point today where we're able to get these operations on the road. People are being able to see these types of technologies deployed for the first time. Right now, people don't trust these technologies. They're afraid of them. They don't want to see them. And if you ask somebody, how do you feel about it? They don't know exactly what they're answering. So they're just like, well, not good. I don't know what that is. I don't want these things on the road. It's not safe. So the approach we've taken is to work with the partners that are willing to have these operations happen in their yard. How do they prove safety? How do they bring about a collaborative environment that brings in the first responders, that brings in the disabled community, the elderly community, those that are subject matter experts in these issues? How do we bring together every person that's impacted by these technologies and then allow these demonstrations to happen so that we can get the data that we actually need so that we can update our rulemakings and standards so that these things can be legally on the roads in the first place? It's all a big collaborative environment, and this is actually the path that we're going to choose to expedite things and move them forward. So we announced $60 million yesterday, and the next slide shows who they are. It's wonderful because we have different approaches to how, some of these research programs are focused on how do you prove the safety of a vehicle if you don't have a perfect built environment. So automated vehicles need the same thing that people need. They need roads that are clear, don't have potholes, have clear signage, have good striping. Well, that doesn't exist in all of America. And so if you're working in a type of situation where you have imperfections, you still have to make sure the vehicle can work. So we have some projects that focus on that. We have others that just focused on the step-by-step updating of our standards that we need to have happen to prove vehicle safety. Others that are focused on work zone connectivity in automated vehicles. The Pennsylvania project is terrific because as we look at work zones, you finally have something to where, as we've seen in previous approaches, if you go to innovators and you say, we just need all of your data, we'll figure out what to do with it. But when we get that, then we'll figure out what to do with it. So just give it to us and we will probably have some good outcomes. So we've tried to flip that around and we say, all right, what can we all agree is a safety outcome we need to work towards? Work zones. They're dangerous for the workers that are in there. They're dangerous for those on the road. Right now, when a work zone goes up, you're required to submit a fax to the state DOT that says there's a work zone that's probably going to be up in this place at this time. Now you know. Well, obviously, we have the technology to digitalize that so that when a work zone goes active or there are workers present at the work zone, we can map it and we can make, using open data standards, we can make that available to your Google Maps, your Waze maps, anything like that, so that you can see where the work zones are active and we can use that to improve safety. Well, why does that matter? Well, if we're talking about the types of data we want to get from vehicles, that is a proven safety measure. That is something that developers are perfectly content to provide and share. So that's step one. If we can focus on work zone data exchanges, we can use that to build out the trust mechanisms. We can use it to prove safety outcomes. And that can be the way that we approach data throughout the system so that when you talk about the city planners and the urban planners wanting all this data from automated vehicle developers and other developers, this is step one. We can build out the mechanisms from here. So that's why I'm excited about those. We can talk about any of these that you want, but I'll keep moving because I think I'm supposed to be wrapping up in 10 minutes. Just highlighting some other of the things, we have a number of other transit-focused initiatives going on. We have $5 million specifically for automated transit vehicles, another $10 million for the sort of integrated payment systems that make transit operations quick and easy. If you look at the Advanced Transportation and Congestion Management Technology Deployment, the ATC-MTD program that Congress kindly named for us, they're very similar to the Automated Vehicle Demonstration Grant deployment systems that we put out there. So if you're looking at the sort of deployments, you'll see this is an annual $60 million amount that we put out that these automated driving systems and connected vehicle deployments will be able to apply to this system, and they'll probably do fairly well. Some of the other things that we wanted to highlight are some of our, the research initiatives are focused around things like if you have to prove the safety of a human driver as they're integrating with these automated vehicle systems, think about the times where you have a system takes over and you are not engaged in the driving activities. Well, what do we need to be able to prove if somebody's driving at 65 miles per hour on the interstate, how long does it really take them to get re-engaged and to safely take over the system? We've seen previous studies that showed it takes 6 seconds. That's probably not good enough for the technologies we're talking about today. We have to do a better job of figuring out how the human and the machine integrate so that we can prove safety if we have trade-offs between the human and the machine, or if the human's expected to take over in an emergency situation. So we're doing those studies. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with these slides. How do we prove the safety of these vehicles? So what we know is if we want to get to the world where you have the safe and full integration of automated vehicles onto our roadways, you have to set new performance-based standards that they have to meet to get there. To do that, you have to figure out how to do variable tests that actually have the vehicles go through these systems, a road test, a vehicle test, not dissimilar from what a human has to do. How can you test them to prove that they meet these standards? Where we are today is figuring out what are those pieces that we can include in a variable testing situation so we can make those performance-based standards. We're here. We need to get all the way over here. And so we're hoping that, the research community can help us figure out these questions on how you prove these things and how you prove the functional safety of these systems in the first place. And we have all sorts of interesting things going on with the different seating configurations or the different things that happen, proving that we have to do things like prove that if you remove a steering wheel, that the airbag will operate as safely as it does if it's on the passenger side. It sounds silly, but the rules were written so prescriptively that if you have 2 passengers in a vehicle, we can't currently allow it because there's no proof that the airbag works just as safely as it does for a passenger side. That's the sort of very basic things we have to prove beyond the benefit of a doubt so we can update our standards. I talked already a little bit about the Work Zone Data Exchange project, so in the interest of time, I'll keep moving because we have some other interesting initiatives. The Karma platform is one that you should be very aware of. This is us creating a data system and some of the information sharing systems that can help cooperative automation. This is a platform that the Department of Transportation has developed and is pushing out to the developer community so we can create some common standards and common approaches to data sharing that can improve the connectivity, collaboration, and so on with the systems. We've seen at least one of the automated driving system demonstration grants is fully incorporating this. A couple others are probably going to, but they're working out specifically how they'll do it. But this is a great platform that is available for free for all of our innovators to use that can help lower the barriers to innovation for all of us. As we look at, again, on the AV, the impacts, Congress provided us some money to look at what are going to be the impacts to truckers specifically is what Congress wanted us to focus on of these automated vehicle technologies. We're also looking at transit operators, and then in a follow-on study, we'll probably look at rideshare services, taxi drivers, package deliverers, others that will be impacted by these technologies. So we hope to get this out soon. I keep learning the joy of getting concurrences and coordinations in the federal government. There are 4 agencies working on this. You have the Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Labor. So hopefully we'll get this out in the near future, but it just takes time in the federal government. But some of the things that we're seeing is we will have an opportunity to engage with the trucking community, with the Teamsters, with the AFL-CIO on these issues over a number of years. One, we don't really know how quickly these technologies will develop, but some of the best estimates say about a decade before the widespread commercial deployment of these systems where they're actually ready to go. We're seeing demonstrations on the road today. But what we've seen with other technologies is it takes about a decade for it to get integrated and saturated through the system. So not making a prediction, you're already looking at least a decade or 2 timeline before this will have any real impacts. You also are aware that there's a shortage of truckers on the road today. If you ask the ATA, the American Trucking Association, they put the number at a shortage of 50,000 truckers. And what we've seen and talked about is we already have 9% of the economy and 9% of the workforce is already focused on transportation and logistics. Those numbers have been going up. So we're seeing an increased pressure, increased demand as people are moving more towards freight and sort of the on-demand type services. This will probably only increase. So you'll have pressures on the workforce there. This can help. The average trucker is 48 years old, and what I didn't know is the average trucker is choosing this as their second profession. They've already had a job for 20 years, 25 years. They're already doing something else. They're choosing this as a second profession, so we have an opportunity to engage with training, where I have an opportunity to shape what that job looks like in the future. Depending on what business model works out and what sort of technologies are developed, we have functions, we have money, we have training programs at the Department of Labor that we can use to make sure that a trucker choosing this as a new profession is trained for what the job looks like tomorrow. And we can't make predictions on the business models, but what we do know is that trucking is a tough job, and one of the things that long-haul trucking makes difficult is time at home. So can we use remote operation capabilities, things like that, where a trucker goes into a warehouse every day and operates a fleet of trucks, but then goes home to their family every day? Can we use this to make positive impacts on people's lives? And then the thing that stands out in all of these things, whether we're talking about truckers or transit operators, is, these are dangerous jobs. You have higher levels of exposure to other drivers on the road. These technologies can increase the safety and the quality of life of truckers, and we have numbers to prove it. So this will be an interesting report. Hopefully we get it out in the near future, but it definitely talks about thinking proactively. How can we engage with the trucking community? How can we engage with the unions and the small trucking workforces out there to make sure that this technology works for them and with them? One of the things I want to highlight that's coming up at the end of next month is we are focusing on accessibility. And we're doing this in a number of ways, but probably the one most interesting, I think, is as we look to develop automated vehicles, we have kind of a blank sheet. They're being developed today in different ways, and you see different formats. But how can we use this opportunity and the billions of dollars going in research throughout the industry into this? How can we use the role of the federal government and the federal dollar to make sure that we're bringing in the engineers and the developers and innovators actually working on these technologies with people that are mobility impaired, that are cognitively impaired, that are visually impaired, that can't hear? How can we bring all of these people together so that the engineers are informed on the front end in developing the systems on what it takes to make a vehicle accessible? We have a white blank sheet. We can do this. So what we're doing is we've been working with the Auto Alliance, working with some of our partners in the disability and accessibility community, bringing them together on the standards that exist today, the standards that need to be developed, and using that to shape how we will develop automated vehicles going forward. And then, if we do it right, we can take those lessons learned and apply them to vehicles today, so we're not waiting for a silver bullet. We can use these lessons learned to increase accessibility on today's vehicles. It's one of the things I'm most excited about, and one of the roles that we think we need to be playing proactively in engaging in these efforts. And we have industry partners that are on board and they're excited, and we have the disability community that's actively engaged and have been waiting for an opportunity just like this. And we also have a number of other initiatives around complete trips and using intelligent transportation systems to reduce the barriers for people with disabilities to get to work or out and about. So one of the things, I'll need to jump through some of these things because I'm already out of time. One of the things that I think is most interesting is we got a petition for exemption from Neuro, a package delivery vehicle that is still under consideration. But what this gives us an opportunity is to create new rules from scratch on if we create a new category for a vehicle that is never intended to have a human in it, how would we do that? And so we can use this one. If this is approved, we'd be able to put some vehicles on the road to be able to create a new category and get the data we need. And that would be a rulemaking over time. But how can we use this approach to prove out a new way of doing regulations for automated vehicles in the future? And they just need to be able to do 4 things. And you have to make performance-based standards based on 4 things. Vehicle has to get from point A to point B. It has to keep passengers safe. It has to not hit people or things on the road. And it has to follow all laws. It's pretty simple. We have to prove it, and it's devilishly tricky and complicated to do it in writing and to something that people can test to. But this is sort of the opportunity we have to use this to prove this out so we can create a new regulatory framework that works in the long run. So this is going to be one of the most interesting things we get to do in government. The last thing I'll leave you with is the Federal Automated Vehicle Strategy. This is something that we recognized that we needed to do, because even 3 months ago, I couldn't tell you who in the federal government all was working on automated vehicles. And I was probably one of the more informed people on this. I had no idea. So we sent one of our guys that worked on us on AV 2.0 and AV 3.0 to the White House, and he's brought together all of the federal agencies. So there's 34, by the way, which I didn't know, but that's kind of important, that are actively engaged. They're investing in this. They have authorities that need to be considered. They support innovation, or they protect intellectual protection. All of these people that need to come together, we're doing that now. And so we're aligning under principles that are very similar to what we did in AV 3.0. on how we approach these things, but also making these resources available to you so that you know where to go in the Small Business Administration. You know what the Department of Justice will do to enforce accessibility compliance. You know how the Federal Trade Commission will enforce how you talk about and how you sell these or oversell these communications, or how you oversell these technologies. The Department of Transportation has lots of money in research and demonstrations. Department of Energy has tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that they're using for the electrification of vehicles to make batteries actually work longer, charge faster, and be more durable. All of these things, not even thinking through, making sure we're bringing in our security partners so they're comfortable with the types of operations that will happen, and use the research that they're already doing around automation and cybersecurity and all of the things that a system needs to do in a war zone. How can we use the billions of dollars that are going towards these systems and bring them to our innovators so that we don't have to recreate the wheel? We can take these lessons learned and incorporate it throughout the system. So this is something I hope we can get out before the end of the year. You heard me talk about how hard it is to get 4 agencies to sign off, so now we have to do 34, which is going to be super fun. But hopefully we can get this out, because I think it's going to be tremendously valuable, and I'm excited about getting this out into your hands. So I believe I've gone over my time. I can end there. We're doing all sorts of other activities around communications and how we talk about these technologies, about bringing in local communities so that they can have the types of demonstrations they're doing, and how we can use all of our partners working together collaboratively to figure out the future that we want and get the potential benefits that these technologies promise into the impacts of these technologies felt throughout the American transportation system. So, I didn't realize I had a timer card right there. I've completely ignored all of that. Do you still want me to do a couple of questions? I'm already over my time. Okay, I'd be happy to.
Thanks for your comments, and a really interesting topic. I was fascinated by your comments about federalism. And, as I'm sure you know, the waiver for California's mileage standard has just been revoked, or will be revoked, I suppose. I want to ask you to comment on that, but I will ask you to comment on 2 issues. One is, how are these autonomous vehicles going to be discussed with respect to pollution and general environmental problems? And the other is, just could you talk a little bit more about the principles behind environmentalism, behind federalism, and what is left to the states and what is done more nationally?
Absolutely. I can start with the environmentalism approach. As you can imagine, we wanted to actively engage our partners at the Department of Energy on these things, because they have a lot of the things, they have a great focus on reducing emissions as well, and they're using the electrification of vehicles as one of the primary approaches to do so. And so you have tens of millions of dollars that are going into creating battery systems and charging systems that can make these systems feasible, because what we've seen is a lot of our autonomous vehicle developers think that an electric vehicle is a type of vehicle they need to have the sort of operations they want to conduct, because a lot of these systems require electricity. It doesn't make as much sense on every vehicle to have a gasoline-powered vehicle that also has to have batteries as well. So by reducing those barriers, we can work towards a goal. A lot of people talk about the AACES approach, where it's accessible, automated, connected, electric, and shared. That is a great goal. That is a great approach. Now, we can't dictate that, but we can certainly create the incentives and lower the barriers towards that being the future, because we know, you have a lot of studies that talk about an autonomous vehicle heaven and an autonomous vehicle hell. By having a coordinated approach where we make sure that we're finding all of the barriers and reducing them, and using our funding and programs to incentivize those outcomes, this is an opportunity to achieve those goals. So there is a great bipartisan collaborative effort in the federal government and in Congress to achieve these outcomes. And I think, it's sort of lost oftentimes that it's a better relationship with these technologies than people may initially think. What was your second question? Oh, the federalized approach and how we see that. cities and states will be the first to assert their authorities over the federal government when they need to. So one of the ways we look at this with technologies, I talked about the FAA and drone regulations. The FAA probably has the authority to assert preemption over any state or local law as it relates to drone operations. Is that the right approach? Probably not. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so what we've done in the drone integration pilot program that kicked off 2 years ago, we have about a year left, is how can we use these opportunities in the development of these technologies to figure out when is it okay to let a city dictate the time, manner, and location of these operations. When is it okay for a city to say, I don't want you flying over a school, or when you fly, I want you to fly along a right-of-way, or what are those sort of things to where people that live in a city can dictate the types of operations that happen around them? The FAA had a great disaster back, I think it was in the 70s, when they allowed supersonic flights over Oklahoma City. Didn't tell anybody because they didn't have to, so they used their preemption to allow sonic booms happen and shattered windows everywhere, and it was not a popular thing. The technology suffered because of it. They didn't have local input on it and local control, and so the technology's not worked out. That's not the reason why supersonic didn't work, but let's use these lessons learned to include the voices of the people where the operations are actually happening so that we can have comfort with the types of operations that happen around people and they don't reject the technologies outright. You have to have that sort of engagement on the local front end, that buy-in from local community, or else it just goes away entirely. I think we have one more question.
Hi. Hi, Finch. This is Anuj Tiwari. And my question is, we have recently grounded Boeing 737 because of the system power failure. And after the death of the first pedestrian by the self-driving car in Arizona in Feb 2018, how the vision of the government has changed for this autonomous vehicle technology?
So I believe the question was, how can we use the lessons learned from the Boeing 737 MAX fatalities and crashes, as well as the fatalities that have happened on the roadway where a vehicle struck and killed a pedestrian on the roadways? How can we use the lessons learned to ensure safety going forward? So I think the MAX example of automation is very illustrative. If you have 37,000 roadway fatalities every year on the road, people are upset about it, but you're seeing a greater outcry over a machine do something that kills people. So far more people die on the roadways. Why are we okay with that? And it's because, oh, it's people. People do this, and people are going to be people, and so, you know, it's the cost of doing business, and it's terrible. People will not accept that when it comes to machines, and so automated vehicles and aviation are held to much higher standards, and that's a great thing. We need to hit those standards. We need to make sure that we're above and beyond any reasonable doubt of should these vehicles be on the road, are they actually safer? We've actually been working closely with the FAA on the lessons learned from automation throughout the 2.0 document, the 3.0 document, and the work we're doing now, because they do have a lot of experience dealing with automated systems and dealing with the human-machine interface. And we've seen it also in the impacts to pilots. If you're talking about their workforce and everything, you know, there were concerns that autopilot would put every pilot out of business. And what you see is there's still a shortage of pilots. They're still highly paid. They're still highly regarded. And so we use those lessons learned. But really, the focus should be on the human-machine interface and making sure people understand what their roles and responsibilities are versus the machine and not overstate it. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have is the vehicles. There is not an automated vehicle on the road today, period. They're not available for sale. Doesn't matter how they're marketed. They don't exist. So when you see people falling asleep in vehicles, when you see them on the road and, you know, taking a nap, that is not okay. Every vehicle that exists today, a human has to be in control. But what we've seen is people get too comfortable with these systems and they abuse them. We need to make sure that in every case, in every way the technology is developed, people understand their role and they act on it. And there are some responsibilities of the driver and there's some responsibilities of the developers. So this is something we're actively engaged on. You may have, there's a stop sign. We're actively engaged on. We've had some events at the Automated Vehicle Symposium in Florida. You'll see more activities on us, but that's sort of the key of everything we have to do because that's going to be, in the short term and near term, the critical work that we have to do. So thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.